we go. And with that, I would like to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Susan.
Thank you, Ron. Well, Phil Unitt is no stranger to many of us. Phil is a native San Diegan and attended San Diego State University, and shortly thereafter, he took a job at the San Diego Museum of Natural History. It wasn't long before he found himself in charge of the bird and mammal collection. Phil has spent his entire professional career at the museum, and today is the Dennis and Carol Wilson Endowed Chair of Ornithology and Curator of the Department of Birds and Mammals. Phil is a specialist in subspecies identification, distribution, and history of distributional change of California birds. Phil has led large survey projects, organizing hundreds of volunteers, participated in numerous expeditions to Baja California, regularly conducts surveys for endangered or at-risk species, has analyzed and interpreted extensive data sets, and prepared more than 4,000 bird specimens. Phil also edits and produces publications on a wide variety of scientific subjects for diverse audiences, both public and professional. Phil is the editor of WUFO's Western Birds and has authored The Birds of San Diego County, co-authored The Birds of the Salton Sea, and authored the San Diego County Bird Atlas. Phil led the San Diego Breeding Bird Atlas project, which includes breeding as well as wintering bird species of birds. Tonight, Phil will discuss the nitty-gritty details of running the San Diego County Bird Atlas project and the lessons he and his team have learned. So please welcome Phil Unitt.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very kind introduction. Let's hope I can live up to it here this evening. Shall I go ahead and share my screen now?
Yeah, you're all set, Phil. The show is yours.
Okay, can everybody see? I hope so. Please.
Yep, looks great.
If not, it's a really delightful opportunity to be able to speak with you tonight, and very exciting to know that you're undertaking a new atlas in Los Angeles. I'm eager to learn more about that because, as we know, birds are constantly changing, and that's what makes ornithology, one of the many reasons ornithology is so fascinating. So our bird atlas for San Diego County was based on 5 years of surveys beginning in the spring of 1997. And we weren't the first to undertake a bird atlas, obviously. And a lot of our field work was in tandem with what you were doing in Los Angeles at the time. So I thought, well, what can we do that's different? And so, of course, we have even more species in winter than we do in summer. And since the system was all set up, said, well, let's do winter in tandem. So we did. So here's our grid system. Is based on the township and range system. That most of the squares are shown on a lot of traditional maps, and had the advantage that over most of the Riverside County line and the entirety of the Imperial County line, those squares coincided with the county boundary. So it made the organization a little simpler. In the areas where the township and range system was never defined, as in the ranchos granted during the period of Mexican rule of California, then we just interpolated. So I know many of you are familiar with San Diego County, but in case you aren't, do keep in mind our topography. From the ocean on the west rather than the south. We go through a series of mesas that then rise up into foothills and then to the peninsular ranges, oriented more north-south than east-west in San Diego County. And then to the east of the mountains in their rain shadow is the Anza-Borrego Desert. Our vegetation is extremely complex. And this map that I made, the various vegetation communities, the colors that you can see coded in the atlas themselves are already greatly simplified, but extensive development near the coast, of course, except in Camp Pendleton, and considerable coastal sage scrub that you see in red, large areas of chaparral you see in yellow, forest on top of the mountains that you see in dark green, and then the desert to the east. So how did we do? Our coverage exceeded my wildest expectations. At the outset, I defined 5 criteria for the breeding season. So minimum 25 hours of surveys in each square, visits to the square in at least 2 of those be in May and June. And for each square, I developed a target list. And the number of species to be seen of that number, 90%, and to be confirmed breeding 50%. Now, it didn't matter, if none of the species were the same as what was on the target list. It was just the number, and to help give folks an idea of what might be out there. So in winter, the criteria were parallel with minimum of 25 hours, but also that the effort be spread over at least 3 years of the 5 years planned for our study. So we all know that many birds are irregular in occurrence in winter. And so I wanted to accommodate that. And I'll come back to that in the last part of the talk to help understand how irregular they really are. And you'll notice that our coverage reached our goals in over 97% of the squares. And we had some considerable data from all squares except for one up here in the middle of Camp Pendleton that's all bombing range, to which we were unable to get access. So how did we present the results? For many species that occur year-round, we have both a map for the breeding season and a map for the winter, because birds represent a spectrum from sedentary to migratory. So we wanted to accommodate those differences. Looking at the breeding season here a little bit more closely, the black-chinned hummingbird is a summer visitor. Also some seen in migration. So those got coded with the light gray squares on the map. As is customary for bird atlases, we had confirmed, probable, and possible nesting. And our observers all recorded the time that they were in the field and a counter estimate of the number of each species. And so by doing that, I was able to calculate a number of birds per hour and then divide those into 3 levels appropriate for the species, so that you can see that the shades of green represent those levels of certainty of breeding, whereas the cross-hatching none, single, or double is the abundance level of those three for tailored fur species. So now in the winter, we didn't have the breeding activity. Anything that was breeding in winter, such as Anna's hummingbirds and birds of prey, those got recorded for the breeding season, and the bird can be recorded for both winter and breeding if it was breeding in the winter. But the winter maps, show just 3 levels abundance, again tailored for the species, and if the species was seen in migration after the 1st of March, our winter season ran from the 1st of December to the 28th or 29th of February. So anything that was reported for the Vesper sparrow in the breeding season got plotted on this this map of winter. So again, for a land bird like the Vesper sparrow, reporting the levels of abundance in number of birds per hour made sense. But for other species, water birds especially, for example, the common merganser, that, okay, if they're just sitting in a flock there on Lake Wolford, is irrelevant how much time you're spending. So just the maximum count seemed to be more meaningful to represent for those species. So what did we learn? One basic question is, where is diversity greatest and least? And no surprise, in Southern California, it's all about water. And so 2 of our major riparian corridors, the Santa Margarita River and the San Luis Rey River in the Northwest, make up our Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent of San Diego County. But many other patches that you can see correspond to strips along the San Diego River, the Sweetwater River, the San Dieguito River, and so forth. So what was true in the breeding season is even more true in the winter. And so the hotspots of diversity in winter are coastal wetlands and also inland lakes. And a part of the story of environmental change in California is the movement of water, the importation of water to Southern California, which has had a huge effect on bird distributions. So what are some of the things we can do with the data? Some modeling can be done at a whole variety of levels. Here's a super simple model overlaying the observed distribution of the acorn woodpecker with the reported distribution of oak woodland. So not surprisingly, they are very close, and the differences may be instructive. For example, down here in Encinitas, there's no oak woodland, but there are extensive oaks planted in the Quail, or now San Diego Botanic Garden, that the acorn woodpeckers colonized. What's this strip hanging out here with no acorn woodpeckers? That's a mistake in the vegetation mapping. So it works both ways. I didn't do the vegetation mapping, the vegetation ecologists did it. Here's something a little bit more complex, looking at the grasshopper sparrow associated with native grassland. And you can see that in many areas, there's a close correspondence, but also substantial areas that are mapped as grassland, but do not have grasshopper sparrows in them. So large areas of south central San Diego County, and also our largest single block of grassland in Warner Valley near Lake Henshaw. Now, much of this has been severely grazed, and so I believe that's the reason why this grassland that's grazed down to practically nothing just cannot support grasshopper sparrows. So a super sophisticated approach to modeling was done by Walter Jetz and his students when he was at UC San Diego, and used our atlas data as a training set of data for various types of models. It runs the whole gamut. So, of course, many species have already undergone severe declines long before the initiation of our study in 1997. So for those species, I mapped localities where the species was known previous to 1997, but not recorded during our study with these red squares. Now, of course, previous to our project, the county was covered only very patchily. So even something like a burrowing owl that was probably quite widespread under primitive conditions, the record is patchy, but that helps dramatize some of the change. And as well as declines, of course, there are species spreading. And one example of that is the purple finch, which historically was known from the higher elevations of the peninsular ranges, but found, sorry, this keeps jumping forward on me. To these lower elevations around Fallbrook and Valley Center, never previously known. And some very experienced birders like Alice Fries and Ken Weaver had spent a lot of time in those areas before 1997. So we were quite sure that this represented recent range extension. And then when we look in a broader regional context, as Lori and I did in our paper published in Western Field Ornithologists Avifaunal Change Symposium in 1997, is part of a broader pattern that we see all over Southern California. We found species new to San Diego County as far as breeding for the first time. And one of those was brewer sparrow. Well, in the 1890s, Frank Stevens had said he found it in late May on North Peak in the Cuyamaca Mountains breeding, but nothing since. And this is the first confirmation of finding actual nests in Ranchita and McCain Valley in the southeast. Very exciting was the colonization of the Summer Tanager, discovered by the late, great Paul Jorgensen in the Anza Borrego Desert. This is an example of a species where we could save a little space in a big fat atlas by mapping the winter records and the breeding season records all on one map. There wasn't any conflict, even though these represent two different subspecies. We found some species to be much more widespread than they were previously known. Scots Oriole had been thought to be just in a narrow strip along the east face of the peninsular ranges. And it's much more widespread, especially in southeastern San Diego County. in chaparral with good numbers of yucca in it. And in winter as well. Before about 1960, Scots Oriole wasn't known as a wintering bird in California at all. And then, a few were seen around Borrego Springs, but it turns out there were a surprising number. And we'll come back to more detail on Scots Oriole at the end of the talk. The tricolored blackbird, we now know, is spiraling down very seriously in Southern California, now on the verge of extirpation in Baja, and Southern California is probably not very far behind. So our mapping of the colonies we knew was really important for this bird. So tabulating every one and the number in each colony best we could estimate. So in the years since the completion of our project in 2002, the tricolored blackbird is spiraled down much more. And for example, this colony in Campo, you go to the site now where there had been 1,000 of them in 1997. There is not even a marsh today. It is completely dried up. You would never know that there had ever even been a wetland. So LeConte's thrasher is a species we studied intensively in 2019, focusing on the Coachella Valley. But we knew a lot about it because finding it for the atlas, we learned how to search for it by the isolated thorny shrub principle. That it's a bird that is more easily found by finding the nest rather than by finding the birds themselves. Because even though our study was sponsored by the Coachella Valley Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan, to get enough sample size to say something about its biology, we included the Anza-Borrego Desert and Joshua Tree in our study area. So we knew just where to look for them in the Anza-Borrego. And I just have to share some of our pictures from the LeConte's thrasher study, the most beautiful eggs you've ever seen, and the most fearsome nest locations you've ever seen. LeConte's thrasher is now on the verge of extirpation, if not actually already extirpated in the Coachella Valley, and the die-off of cholla during our cycles of drought is an important, if not the most important factor. Okay, let's look at the question of the effects of habitat fragmentation. San Diego, as you probably know, is built on this topography of mesas and canyons, and many of the canyons retain substantial native vegetation, coastal sage scrub or chaparral. And so it's a natural laboratory for the study of the effects of habitat fragmentation. And that's been used by some really big name biologists like Michael Soule. But our atlas data also give us an important and different perspective on those studies. So let's take a look at 74 atlas squares underlying metropolitan San Diego, and take that little pink layer there and slide it underneath our maps for some species like the wren tit. So here we see there are 7 of those 74 squares that did not have wren tits during our atlas study. So we could say that the wren tit is not terribly susceptible to habitat fragmentation, but maybe a little bit. In California quail, there are 13 of those 74 where it's missing. So that's a bit more sensitive. Rufous-crowned sparrow. Now it's missing from 22 of those 74. So very definitely sensitive to habitat fragmentation. We go up to the greater roadrunner, Western meadowlark. My grandmother always talked about, oh, where have the meadowlarks gone? Lesser nighthawk within our 74 square area there, persisting mainly in Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. So let's compare to a study by Doug Bolger et al. Published in 1997, where they ranked the species sensitivity to fragmentation by the method that we just did with those maps we were just looking at. And lo and behold, even though the methods were totally different, you know, they had their counts in the canyons and a completely different way from an atlas, yet they're remarkably similar. Bush tit, okay, no sensitivity. Scrub jay, you know, maybe slightly. California towhee, very slightly. Moving up through this hierarchy with many of the species in the same position. Now, we get down to some of the most highly sensitive species, though, and we see they were ones that were not even covered in Bolger's study. So the western meadowlark, the horned lark, grasshopper sparrow, cactus wren, lesser nighthawk. So especially these grassland birds have suffered from the ill effects of habitat fragmentation even more than the scrub birds that were the focus of these studies. The sage sparrow or bell sparrow is the most sensitive of all of these species. You see that there's a block in Miramar and very few otherwise in our 74 square study area. And they identified that in Bolger's study. Bolger also emphasized the black-chinned sparrow. And you might think, oh, well, that's missing from 58 instead of 55. But the question is, was the black-chinned sparrow even there originally? So we can look with the historic data. And the sage sparrow, yes, they were all over what is now the city of San Diego in the early 1900s. Whereas the black-chinned sparrow was not. Its distribution was always more inland. Okay, let's move on to the cactus wren here. Already by 1997, it had been eliminated from many sites where it formerly occurred near the coast. One of the procedures in our project was not only counting the birds in a square and trying to confirm their nesting activity, but for certain sensitive rare species like the cactus wren, then we asked the participants to plot the points where they saw them. Now, 1997 seems like 1,000 years ago now in technology terms, where rather than putting an X on a map, now you can just take a GPS point. So this would actually be vastly easier today. But we got between 6,000 and 7,000 sensitive species points recorded, and those were all plotted for us by the County Department of Planning and Land Use. So immediately after the completion of our project in 2002, history turned a corner. And that's when the 21st century, the century of fire, really started. And so there was a big fire on the east side of the mountains in 2002, and then much bigger fires in 2003 that put us on the vanguard of what the entire rest of the Western US is experiencing these days, leaving landscapes like this in our wake with not much bird habitat. So for the cactus wren, which suffered severely, really the core of the remaining habitat of the subspecies sandiegensis around Lake Hodges and San Pasqual was burned. And then those small outlying populations that might have seemed marginal before now assumed a much larger role in their conservation. So fortunately, we had some good ideas of where those surviving populations were. So as you may know, after the Atlas project was done in 2002, and then the fires came along in 2002 and 2003, it was like, oh, okay, now we have a basis for understanding the effects of those fires because we have a substantial pre-fire data set. So in 2002, after the Pines fire, which was the second largest fire in San Diego County history at that time, we started our surveys with a bunch of survey routes, all coordinated with our Atlas grid. So each of the routes was within a single Atlas square. And then 2003 came along and burned so much more, including basically the entirety of the Cuyamaca Mountains. So we added routes there. And then what did we find? We followed up for 5 years afterward and found the whole spectrum of responses, from very positive in the case of the lazuli bunting. I don't think it was appreciated previously how much fire following is a part of its biology. So these analyses that Lori refined, looking at both the response over the 5 years following the fire, taken as a whole, and the progression within those 5 years. So the lazuli bunting had a very positive response to the fire, but then that dwindled away over the succeeding 5 years. Similarly, with the black-chinned sparrow that colonized large areas of the Cuyamaca Mountains that were once forested, and it was absent, but then became chaparral, and it colonized. And you can see the burnt stick in the photograph here by Jack Danes. So in addition to looking at the results from our counts, we can also look in the context of the Atlas squares. So if a species is entirely absent from a whole Atlas square, that's a whole different level of response than just the counts. So here with the bush tit, you see there's a huge drop in the Pines fire area from 97 to 2001, our Atlas data. It was in all 17 squares, no surprise, before, and then dropped way down to only 4 the next year. But it reoccupied that range pretty quickly. So now whether the population as a whole had recovered. Perhaps it was getting close after 5 years. So two different perspectives. When we submitted our paper for publication, also in our Western Field Ornithologists Avifaunal Change Symposium, one of the reviewers said, choose one method of analysis. And okay, so we did, because the reviewers told us to. But multiple methods give you different perspectives. Buick's wren, not quite so badly affected initially, and again, fairly rapid recovery. Looking at that context of the number of squares is a different perspective. See, the rock wren spread hugely. This column on the right, the number of squares that was changed from our atlas study before the fire, and then the 5 years of survey after the fire. The mockingbird spread, loggerhead shrike spread, sage sparrow spread, rufous crowned sparrow, and lazuli bunting, not surprisingly. And then species whose range is contracted, like the California thrasher, pygmy nuthatch, mountain chickadee, Hutton's vireo. So this is our publication, which I urge you to take a look at the WFO website. The punchline is how we plotted each species in the space of positive versus negative over the 5 years taken together, or rate of recovery would be very rapid recovery on the right, slow or no recovery on the left. So in that latter category, California thrasher, still after 5 years, missing from a large fraction of the squares where it had been before. And Hutton's vireo was the absolute worst in terms of the spatial response, with almost no recovery in 5 years. Because of the atlas we knew of all these species in the Cuyamaca Mountains, even though the populations were very small and all of them were extirpated after the cedar fire of 2003. So I know I talked to you before about the gray vireo, but I can't resist mentioning it a little bit again. So we tried to cover everything, even these most remote squares in the Anza-Borrego Desert, where it seemed like there was absolutely nothing. Well, Lori went to this square in 98 and saw the elephant trees and told me about it. We went, and lo and behold, we found wintering gray vireos, the first ever found in California. So that was one of the most exciting discoveries of the project. The breeding distribution that we observed was critical to our study of their nesting success and failure in 2012 and 2013. And in just those 10 years from the completion of the Atlas study to the inception of the gray vireo study, all these areas in north central San Diego County where we had found the gray vireo before, we were unable to relocate it except for that one stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail near Indian Flats Campground. So back to an expanding species, the orange-crowned warbler. The early ornithologists found it only in the high mountains of San Diego County and along the coast near Point Loma. But during our study, we found that the entire area had been filled in by a breeding population. And so does this represent the subspecies lutescens coming south and down from the mountains, or the subspecies sordida expanding out from the coast or from the Channel Islands like Allen's hummingbird? Probably some of both. So another expanding species is the Western bluebird. And I have to share my favorite quote of all time with respect to the Western bluebird, written in a Birds of Ventura County in 1886 by Barton Everman. He said of the Western bluebird, "It is but rarely seen about our dwellings, but stays in more secluded retreats. Boxes which, raised on poles in the garden or about the barn, so readily tempt the eastern cousin, have no charms for our wild Western bird. But time, the civilizer, will doubtless work a reform in this bird, and then it will learn to build its nest in the hollow limb of the tree by the house and in the box raised from the garden fence." So, time the civilizer, that's what we call evolution, seen in real time. So Michael Soule and his collaborators, their landmark paper on the effects of habitat fragmentation. You see they plotted these canyons for their study and rated their species. The Buick's wren as kind of moderately sensitive. See it there on the axis. Since then, Buick's wren has exploded as an urban adapter. And we saw that to some extent already in our atlas data. And then 3 years ago, I decided to go to some of these canyons that I could get to in my bicycle in a half hour. And in each of those green highlighted canyons, took me 30 seconds to find Buick's wren. So another example, like the Western bluebird, of evolution happening in real time. We can use eBird as a comparison to our atlas data. So all these recent eBird reports are from squares where we did not find Buick's wrens during the breeding season. The California gnatcatcher recolonized Point Loma. It's colored red in our map in the bird atlas, but then it colonized in 2006 and has remained ever since. So let's take a look at our winter results here, since that's of immediate interest to you now. The punchline to me from the winter data was how variable birds were, and species that I didn't really expect. So this is a brand new analysis I just did in preparation for tonight, looking at the observed abundance, just the number counted of these various species in the 5 winters of our project. Those are the orange line, excuse me, the green lines in the graph are the observed. The orange lines are the expected. For the number of squares, that's just the proportion of squares that we covered at any level in that year. So We were a little slow getting started the first year, and then the middle 3 years of the project, we had the strongest effort, and then the last year, it dropped off a little bit. And then the bottom graph there, the number observed, the orange for expected is based on the time spent in the field. So the number of hours, again, was greatest in those middle 3 years. So you'll see for each species that shape of the graph is the same, even though the numbers will vary. So American robin, everybody knows that's a highly variable species in winter, and not surprised that is borne out by our observations. And these probability values are just from a chi-squared test, looking for the significance of deviation between observed and expected. So before we play too much with this, okay, no surprise that the American robin is variable and would be significantly so. But let's look at species that we don't expect to be variable to see if this approach is even worthwhile. So, greater roadrunner, a resident species, being a pretty big bird, we expect it to be fairly long-lived. So, as far as number of atlas squares in which it was seen each winter, that pretty well corresponded to expectations. As far as the number of observed, that was apparently significant, being a bit higher in the first couple of years of the study and lower in the last 3 years. California thrasher, totally resident. And again, the spatial distribution was stable. The numbers, a little bit off. The wren tit, pairs remaining together for their whole lives on one territory. So the spatial distribution, no surprise, was stable through the 5 years. The numbers did vary a little bit. California thrasher, similar story. Spatial distribution, pretty stable, but the numbers still managed to fluctuate a bit from expectations. Titmouse, okay, that conforms pretty closely to expectations. So for these resident birds, not any great surprises. California quail, a little bit extra, exceeding expectations in years 2 and 3, lagging expectations in years 4 and 5. California gnatcatcher, definitely exceeding expectations in years 1 and 2, lagging expectations in year 4 and 5. We're starting to see a little bit of a pattern maybe. So guess what? It's all about water. So the first winter of the study, we had this great rain year, 18 inches in downtown San Diego, definitely El Nino. And then it dropped and dropped, came back a little bit, and then dropped to barely over 3 inches for still the driest winter San Diego has ever experienced. So that was reflected in many birds, and perhaps none more strongly than brewer sparrow. So we had a huge spike in the winter after the wet winter. So that spring following the wet winter, the plants grew, they had seeds, and those seeds were still lying around the next winter when the brewer sparrows came to eat them. So very few after that. So granivorous species, you might expect to show this, this pattern most strongly. So for the lesser goldfinch, maybe slightly exceeding expectations as far as spatial distribution in year 2, but very definitely exceeding the numbers in year 2. Lawrence's goldfinch, even more strongly. I don't know why there was a spike in year 5, but really strong spike in year 2. Mourning dove, in fact, not nearly so strong, but with the numbers exceeding expectations in years 1 and 2, lagging after that. Lincoln sparrow. Now, when we were working on our fire study, one of our years we had this enormous spike of Lincoln sparrows. And I thought, oh my God, there has never been an invasion of Lincoln sparrows reported previously. But if I had done this analysis with our atlas data, I would have realized that, oh yeah, maybe something like that could be expected. So Lincoln sparrow as well had a very substantial spike in year 2 of the atlas study. So let's turn from granivores to frugivores, the hermit thrush, which we know to be a species irregular in winter. But that irregularity was expressed during our study mainly by a spike in year 2. Now, 2 very interesting species are the mockingbird and the western meadowlark. If you look in the classic 1964 Birds of Arizona, it talks about these species appearing out of nowhere after wet winters. And we saw that in the Anza-Borrego Desert as well in 1998. So did that effect then carry over to the following winter? Maybe not really with the spatial distribution for the mockingbird, but more so with the numbers. With the western meadowlark, still a bit of a spike above expectations in year 2. So a little bit of an effect left over from the previous breeding season. The house wren was another bird we had a big spike of after a wet winter of the fire study. And now looking back at our atlas data, we can see very strongly. So it affects not only granivores and frugivores, but also insectivores. The fire study had a spike after a wet winter in the yellow-rumped warbler, but that wasn't really very strong in our atlas data. Even the Townsend's warbler, which you would think, you know, does an arboreal insectivore like that really make that much difference? But again, very strong spike in the second winter. So, but of course, there's other species that have other patterns. And among them was the poor will. And it was during the wet winter that we had the most poor wills. They were calling most actively. Cassin's finch, we had a big invasion of those, only 1 year of the 5 in 2000, winter 2000, 2001. And mountain bluebird, an invasion in that same year. and Scots Oriole. Now, who thought that Scots Oriole was an irregular species, especially in winter? We had a very strong spike of them in year 3 of our study. So it's just one example of the many surprises that came out of this. And I'm sure you will encounter some of these patterns as well and find yet new ones as well. So I sure wish you luck with that. And that's my story. And I'm glad to try to answer any questions I can, just talk about any of this fun stuff you like.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. That was wonderful. And let me get some things up and going here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we Q&A here.
You're really getting us jazzed, of course, for our next go round of the Atlas. I can't wait.
Mm-hmm.
So you're
So
still
what are your plans?
you're still using this data, and you collected it quite a few years ago. So it's pretty amazing. It's still being, actively used in informing
A few
what's happening.
decades ago, actually.
Yeah, the types of analyses, we've still just begun to scratch the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, go
So,
ahead, Lance.
For your winter atlas, Phil, how did you decide on 25 hours? And was 25 hours uniform across all habitats, or did it vary, say, coastal slope versus the desert?
The 25 was uniform for all squares. So one of the criteria for coverage was to be sure to visit every habitat. And all of our participants got vegetation maps of their squares so they could see where the habitats were. But no standard for amount of time per habitat. So
How many participants did you actually have in your Atlas project?
well,
Both reading and winter. Yeah.
yeah. So we combined those together. We really didn't consider them as separate projects. It was really all one project, and the number of participants was almost kind of an asymptotic approach to infinity, because we had our core of probably 100 people who were really avid and volunteered for multiple squares or participated in multiple of our blockbuster weekends. And then as we were coming down to the end of the project, we had our attack squad. So the attack squad folks, they would call me up, say, Phil, I can go in the field tomorrow. Where shall I go? And so I would email them the list of, okay, we still need work in this square. This is what's been seen. This is what's been confirmed. Go for it. And so that actually was a very successful technique in speeding us to our goal at the end.
Yeah, I don't have our Atlas handy. Lance, do you recall how many blockheads we had in 95 and 99?
I'm afraid I don't, but there was certainly a concerted effort
Oh, yeah.
of the blockbusters, as they were known, to sweep things up. And I know that Larry Allen went above and beyond even what they did, sweeping up places that hadn't received adequate attention.
Right.
Dozens of blocks.
Yeah.
Our procedure for our blockbuster weekends, we would find some campground that was convenient to a block or an area of poorly covered squares. And then we would meet there first thing Saturday morning, break up into teams to cover the area best we could, then get together Saturday evening, camp at the site, and then repeat the next morning, going to different squares or sometimes the same ones to do that. So it was a really good way to build teamwork and camaraderie, and to link some of our less experienced participants with the more experienced. So, I say that the human dimension of this project, the people who upgraded their skills and who made new friendships, was as gratifying as anything we learned about the birds.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, for the levels of effort, one of the things that we hope to do with the next LA Atlas is to utilize eBird extensively. In fact, use it as our primary data entry tool. And there are ways that you can have it. You can configure it for a fee, where it will keep track of your effort in each one of the blocks: the number of hours, the number of species, the number of eBird checklists, and so forth. So you can get real-time feedback on your progress. It's one of the things I've been doing that's been leading up to this is I've been helping with the state atlas in Maine for the last 4 years. And they update the breeding bird part of it every day. eBird automatically updates it. So you can tell the next morning, okay, is this block, done, or do I need to put more effort into it?
So one of the issues with eBird, is it doesn't have any scale. So by this custom app, eBird app, or I guess does that, then you can send it a grid system to define.
Okay, so it sounds like you don't use eBird very much. At least for the Maine Bird Atlas, they have set up a grid system for the whole state with 4,000 squares, rectangles. They're not quite square. And yeah, I mean, when you choose a specific place, which they have defined on their own ArcGIS website, and also with eBird, they have defined both ways. They also have apps that you can bring into the field with you, so you can, using your phone, see very precisely, at least for places with suitable coverage, that is cell phone coverage, where you are. Or if you're sufficiently savvy and have a satellite access, also in places without cell phone coverage, so you can tell. Now, yes, there's still complications associated with things like eBird hotspots that are, very close to boundaries between blocks and so forth. And learning how to deal with that is one of the reasons we're doing a test run this winter.
So, have you been able to unify your Los Angeles Atlas grid into eBird? I mean, what you described was done for the state of Maine.
So for the LA trial atlas, so again, we're doing just 13 blocks this winter as a test run. Yeah, we utilize some of the same blocks that were defined in the first Los Angeles County Breeding Bird Atlas in 1995. Kimball chose the majority of them, and we, with the help of Ted Kyle, who is a real whiz at doing ArcGIS things with working with KMZ files, he set it up for us and set up the KMZ files, and Mark Scheel imported that onto Google Maps on our website. So if you go to our website, you can see the layout of where the different blocks are. And if you check this when you're using your smartphone, you can see where you are within or relative to the block boundaries for the blocks that we're checking. So it's potentially very precise. I mean, as precise as your location can be with a cell phone, which should be good to within 10 meters or even maybe better. But getting back to your winter effort though, so I still don't understand how you got 25 hours. What made you choose?
Oh, well, okay. That was parallel to some other projects that had been done around the country. But, I also was balancing, okay, this is the number of squares we have. This is roughly the number of observers we have. How much can we really expect to get? Okay, if you go into the field in a square, okay, let's, plan on spending, 4 or 5 hours. Well, if you go back to a square, 5 times for 5 hours, that seemed like you were getting to, pretty thorough coverage, provided that you were visiting all the habitats. So, it was to balance the level of effort, but there was nothing to say that you couldn't go beyond 25. And sometimes it was necessary to go beyond 25 to confirm the number of species needed by fraction of the target list. And then some squares where, like Los Peñasquitos Lagoon, where there were, people were doing a regular count, those data fed into the atlas, and the amount of effort was well in excess of 100 hours. So that's why in those graphs that I did for the numbers, that was normalized by effort.
Cool. Hey, Mark, I think we have a couple of Q&As.
We have a couple questions. Lily asks, do you think the Scots Oriole winter invasion is due to climate change?
I can't really say. A lot of those areas where the Scots Orioles were wintering were not well covered at all previously, because the spread of Scots Orioles winter range north into California, began in the 1960s. It seems like climate change may not be the whole story. It's probably part of the story. It's a good
That's a good question.
subject for birdists to sit around and wonder about.
Okay.
I welcome your thoughts.
Kimball asks, what proportion of San Diego blocks received coverage in all 5 winters? That is, which proportion you can track year-to-year variations through all the years?
Oh, that's a really good question. I didn't figure that. I would say that was probably on the order of half.
And for coverage across multiple winters, did you request that it be evenly distributed, or how did that work?
So the criterion was at least one visit in at least one visit in at least 3 years. The square could be visited every winter, and certainly many of them were. The results from all the Christmas bird counts into the atlas. So those obviously had coverage every year. But if you adopted a square and say then you went in the winter of 97, and you reached your goal for number of species that first year, and you reached the goal for number of hours, 25 in the first year, you would still need to go in year 2 and go again in year 3 for us to say, okay, we've reached the goal for that square. Does that clarify it?
So the 25 hours was cumulative over the whole
Yes.
5 years. It
Yes.
was not per year.
Per year, yeah.
Mhm.
Right, but it also means that even if you do 25 hours in 1 year, you're not done. You know,
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You got to put in a significant level of effort in other years too,
Mhm.
at least several hours, depending on how
Yeah.
much you put in
Cool.
each year.
So, it's a tricky situation. I mean, birders, people, citizen scientists, you want to make a level that will yield scientifically valuable results, but not so complex that it's discouraging. So, we tried to strike a balance there too.
Free food helps also.
Twice a year, we had recognition events
There you
For-
go.
for our people,
Great idea.
where we would get together, like one time we did the wild animal park, at the Chula Vista Nature Center, the Gemological Institute in Carlsbad, some venue where it would be fun just for everyone to get together and have some food
Mhm.
and a program. So, and to recognize our participants who achieved various levels of coverage and give
Yeah.
them prizes, hats, binocular straps. So,
Yeah. That sounds great. It sounds like San Diego was wonderful in your Atlas effort and all that. And good. Anything else, Mark or Lance?
Well, Susan and Frank, you guys have been kind of quiet for a few minutes. Do you have other comments, questions?
I was just sitting here thinking about the level of effort and, motivating people over a 5-year period to try to, to do the kind of, data collection that this represents. And I think it's really, a tribute to the organizers that it actually works so well. And that some of these, the recognition events and getting together and sort of building communities and having, sort of mentoring activities, all those things. So it was really more than just a breeding bird atlas in the end.
Oh, yeah.
and multiple complementary strategies. And we had a steering group of really great advisors. Ken Weaver, Mike Evans, Kirsten Winter, sorry, I'm forgetting everyone right now, but we would have regular meetings as well and talk about exactly these sorts of questions of how to develop these, complementary methods. Like it was Conrad Sankpill who suggested the attack squad, and that proved to be hugely successful.
Mm-hmm.
So one big question we didn't ask is funding. How did you pay for all this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a lot of my work. We had significant fund. I mean, I need to get a copy of the atlas because there's like 14 major funders listed in there, acknowledged, beyond the individual contributors. So, and these, contracts and cost share agreements were done in various ways. And it was complex, but with the U.S. Forest Service, Caltrans, California State Parks, U.S. Navy. I know I'm forgetting a bunch of really important ones.
Well, you
And
also
then-
had many different individual supporters as well.
Yes, that I really have to acknowledge the late Burt McIntosh, because at one of our recognition events, as we were getting up to the end, he said, I challenge you to join our Century Club of donors of $100. And that turned out to be hugely successful. Bert was the charismatic leader, which really helped. And to have that kind of support was really huge. So I remember him and his wife, Margaret, as two of my closest friends of all time.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about how you handled nocturnal species, both in the breeding and winter?
Yeah, we didn't have the criteria for nocturnal species that, probably would have been good. That would have been another thing to layer on, for any number of squares to reach the goal for number of the target list. That required some nocturnal work, but we didn't have a formal criterion or goal for nocturnal coverage. So if you formulate something like that for Los Angeles, I'd be interested in hearing how you did it.
I mean, at the end of the first Los Angeles County, breeding bird atlas, there was one extra season, that was added primarily for nocturnal birds. And I was one of the people who helped with that up in the San Gabriel Mountains, although there was only so much we could really do, just with a small number of teams available. Again, Larry Allen was just heroic in his efforts to cover extensive areas, particularly in urban Los Angeles. And so those blank spots in central LA, real, he went there for looking for things like great horned owls. But yeah, I mean, it's always an issue with most of the atlases, because looking for nocturnal birds requires a special level of insanity. And there are obvious safety issues involved, and it might be cold and it's dark, and you worry about your car breaking down and all that sort of thing. So it's always going to be a struggle to get adequate coverage.
Definitely.
Yeah, that was for our Blockbuster weekends, where they were campouts. That was a good opportunity to extend our nocturnal coverage.
Oh, sure, definitely. Well, I think we're kind of slowing down on the questions and answers, Phil. I want to thank you very much for presenting for us tonight. Not only was it a great program, but it's so relevant to our efforts at the moment, and I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And I'm we always just learn so much from each other. So
absolutely. And just as a reminder for everyone that's still with us, next week we have Pelagic Birds with John Feenstra at 7 o'clock. Be sure and tune in for that.
And 2 days from now we have the
yes,
meeting.
very important. 2 days from now we have a recap. Is that what you're calling it?
Well, it'll be an update on our progress, how we're doing in our trial winter atlas. It'll be a question and answer period. We look forward to hearing people's suggestions and additional thoughts.
Yeah, and we have one more month, basically loosely, to go for our trial winter bird atlas. So very, very important and exciting to tune in on Thursday at 7 o'clock. And the notices have gone out. Rebecca did put a link to the registration in the chat, so you can go to that and just register for it. It's anyone. You don't have to be a member of LA Burgers to register and attend. And with that, I think we'll see you all on Thursday night. Thank you again, Phil. I really
Yep, thank you,
appreciate
Phil.
Thank you. That was
Thank
great. I
you.
really appreciate your insights.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil.
This was
Absolutely.
awesome.
Absolutely. And we'll see everyone on Thursday and next Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.